All right. Good morning, everyone. It's time to get started. So, as we normally do, I'm going to go over our verse alert. It's 1 Corinthians 15, 3 and 4. And remember, we're going to be saying this out loud next week. So, verse alert. And the reference here is 1 Corinthians 15, 3 and 4. For I delivered unto you first of all that which I also received, how that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he rose again the third day according to the Scriptures. 1 Corinthians 15, 3. All right, let's do that one more time. And the reference is 1 Corinthians 15, 3 and 4. For I delivered unto you first of all that which I also received, how that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he rose again third day according to the Scriptures. 1 Corinthians 15, 3, 4. All right, so today I'm in Utah, so I made this video for you. And what I wanted to do is kind of go back to the first week where we talked about the significance of our faith. And we talked about 1 Corinthians 15 and how if the resurrection, the physical bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ, that's not true, then our faith is in vain. It's just, everything's meaningless and it's a bad deal. We ought to be pitied because we believe the lie and it's just terrible. So there's this argument called the minimal facts argument, or the best explanation of the resurrection. And I wanted to share that with you today. But in order to share that with you, I wanted to go over a few different kinds of reasoning. And then the last kind will be this minimal facts argument. Talk about that. So it's our adult Sunday school class, our faith. And today we're going to be talking about an argument for the historical resurrection of Jesus Christ. So our faith is a resurrection faith. This is an apologetic for the resurrection. There's different kinds of reasoning, and the one that we're going to land on is abductive. And there's more than just these three. These are kind of the big ones that get used a lot. But we're going to go over these different kinds. So as it pertains to providing reasons for your faith, so that way it's not blind faith. That way you're not just believing something for no reason at all, or for bad reasons. You ought to be able to give reasons for why you believe what you believe and be able to describe what you believe and why you believe it. So the way that you can do that is through these kinds of reasoning: deductive reasoning, inductive reasoning, and abductive. So your beliefs should be backed up by reasons. Reasons can be called premises. So if you have premises that lead to a conclusion, then are using deductive or inductive reasoning. Abductive is kind of different, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So if your premises are true, then your conclusion must be true. If we're talking about deductive reasoning, goal of deductive reasoning is certainty. So like absolute truth. I am certain about this. So what it does is it begins with a general fact and then reasons down to a specific. Start with general, get down to the specific. Again, the way that it's formed, form of the argument, truth of the premises entails the truth of the conclusion. That means entails means it follows. Follows logically to the conclusion. So the conclusion follows, and if it follows necessarily from the premises, then it must be true. Have to accept it. That's deductive reasoning. So what would be an example? I've got a couple of examples for each one. Some of them will be silly. Some of them, I don't know. We'll see. See if you like them. So, the first one: all hobbits have furry feet. It's true. It's a true statement. So notice it's a general statement, though. All hobbits have furry feet. Bilbo Baggins is a hobbit. Okay, it's premise two. It's true. Therefore, this is your conclusion. Bilbo Baggins has furry feet. So notice the way that it's set up. You have a general statement. You have a particular that leads to a particular truth about the first part of the second premise. So again, we're moving from the general down to a specific truth. Now, if both premises 1 and 2 are true, then it logically and necessarily follows that the third premise have to accept it. So, again, all hobbits have furry feet. Bilbo Baggins is a hobbit. Therefore, Bilbo Baggins has furry feet. So notice you're taking the first all hobbits. That's going to be part of your second premise, right? Bilbo Baggins is a hobbit. Well, that's true. Bilbo Baggins has furry feet. It's kind of like math. So you kind of go A equals B equals C. Therefore, A equals C. In this case, A is a general statement. C is a specific statement. And while this is great, like you have to accept the conclusion, it's usually pretty obvious. So here's another example. All Christians believe Jesus rose from the dead. One, you claim to be a Christian, believing the resurrection, one of those necessary beliefs, you have to hold if you call yourself a Christian. All Christians believe Jesus rose from the dead. Gerald is a Christian. Therefore, Gerald believes Jesus rose from the dead. It follows. Boom, boom, boom. Now, someone might argue that, well, Gerald doesn't actually believe that. He's just fooling you. Something like that. And that's kind of not the point. With deductive reasoning, when you get to the conclusion, as long as the first two, it could be more premises, but in this case, there's just two. As long as the first two are true and follow, then the conclusion is necessarily true. You have to accept it. So, there are not many deductive arguments for the existence of God. There's one called the ontological argument, and it's kind of complex, and we may look at it later in the future when we talk about just theology proper and doctrine of God, God the Father. But we may look at it then. But again, it's kind of a complex argument. But again, it's deductive. You take the definitions of kind of general terms, apply them to specifics, and get a specific conclusion that you have to believe, have to accept. The next is inductive reasoning. We use this all the time. This is uh, the main kind of reasoning that scientists use, right? So we're using past experience to make future predictions. Now, because we're using past experience, we can't have certainty. Now, what we're assuming here is that we're assuming that nature is reliably predictable. We're also assuming that the future will likely be just like the past was. So our past experience will inform our future predictions. But we can't be absolute about it. Deductive reasoning, certainty. But with inductive reasoning, we can't have certainty. All we can have are probabilistic conclusions, something that is probably true. It could be proven false in the future, perhaps. So what would be an example of this? So aspirin helps with the pain of headaches. Okay. Every time I've taken aspirin in the past, it has helped my headache. Therefore, when I take aspirin this time, it will alleviate my headache. So there's a general truth. Aspirin helps pain. What aspirin is medicine that helps with pain of headaches. A lot of people take aspirin for it. Then I appeal to my past experience. Every time I've taken aspirin in the past, it helped my headache. So, should I take aspirin, have a headache in the future, or if I have one presently? Well, yeah, my reasoning would lead me to believe that it's a good idea to take aspirin this time, and it'll alleviate my headache. Um, Another example: most men in ancient Israel had beards. Jesus of Nazareth was a man who lived in ancient Israel. Therefore, Jesus probably had a beard. Now, wasn't there, but given what we know about ancient Israelite customs and um, facial hair, uh, what was believed about men and how it was manly to have a beard, um, then it would lead us to the conclusion that Jesus, being a man during that time, within those customs, probably had a beard. Now, it could potentially not be true. Wasn't there. I don't know what Jesus looked like, but it's probably true. And it's good reasoning. Like, based on those two premises, the conclusion is reasonable. Okay, yeah, you ought to accept it, unless you have some kind of really strong countervailing evidence. Um, it would be unreasonable to reject the conclusion. So there's still no guarantee that the conclusion is correct, but what is known about ancient Israelite customs would lead us to believe that the conclusion is true. Now, the problem is that there can always be outliers, right? So, in the first example, maybe I take aspirin and it doesn't help headache. Possible. Maybe I ate something and messed with the reaction in my body, and aspirin didn't actually help. That's possible, but it could be that I take the aspirin and it helps every time. That too. Maybe another example would be like if I have like a little coin purse and I pull out a coin and it's a penny. Sweet penny. Pull out another one, it's a penny. Pull out another one, it's a penny. I go, okay, every time I pull out a coin, it's going to be a penny. That would be my conclusion based on my experience. Now, is that absolutely true? No, it could be a quarter, it could be a dime, it could be something else. But all my previous experience has been pennies. Well, something could change in the future. It could be outliers. Not, and I only say that to say that with inductive reasoning, it's probabilistic. It's probable that this is true. It's not like certainty. Have certainty comes to inductive. Now, last one is abductive reasoning. So now what we're doing here is eliminating what is obviously not true and considering what is most likely to be true. So there's a quote from Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the author of Sherlock Holmes. One of his books, Sherlock Holmes says, when you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be truth. And that really sums up abductive. What you do is you take in as much data points. In this case, if it's Sherlock Holmes, it's a kind of murder mystery, right? Something like that. Takes in as much data as possible and then comes up with the most likely explanation, considering all of the data points as available to him. So, eliminate what's obviously not true, and then you figure out, try and come up with the best explanation for all of the data that you have. Now, if we're talking about the resurrection, existence of God, or something like that. Notice what it says: when you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. Now, if you have a worldview that already defines God, miracles, the resurrection as impossible, then you've already eliminated a certain set of explanations without even considering them. Now, if that's the case, that's unreasonable. Not, you're not, you don't have a good reason to reject those explanations. Right? You've already rejected them from the outset based on your presuppositions. That's not a reason to reject something. It's just, I already made this assumption, so I'm not even going to entertain those ideas. Now, if that's the reason you're not entertaining those ideas, that's a bad reason and unreasonable. But if you are, that's not the reason, then maybe you can be persuaded. Abductive reasoning. So we're eliminating what's obviously not true, considering what's most likely to be true. That way, we can draw a conclusion. We're drawing a conclusion based on the best explanation, based on the explanation that best explains the state of events rather than from evidence provided by premises. There aren't really any premises, abductive reasoning. A good way to think about it is it's an inference to the best explanation. A couple of examples. Get to the minimal facts argument. First, you and your wife went to a family get-together. Both wake up with a fever and runny nose. Sister just got over a cold. Conclusion: both caught a cold from your sister. Like, probable. It's probably true. Given the facts that we have, that's a reasonable conclusion. It led you have an explanation for why you're sick. So again, we're just using these data points, reasoning to a conclusion, which kind of follows a little bit, not necessarily premise follows, but it makes sense. It's a good explanation for all the facts that you have. So here's another one. Gerald told you that he had a fight with the pastor. Seen Gerald at church since the pastor preached on lust. You have seen Gerald at a restaurant after church. It's out. Conclusion: Gerald has dropped out of church. Oh no, not the teacher on video. What's going on? But notice, given the information that you have, your conclusion is reasonable based on the information you have. So, an explanation that Gerald is sick is ruled out because you saw Gerald, saw me, at a restaurant after church usually gets out. Say you church lets out, go to a restaurant after church, get something to eat, and you see me there. Okay, well, not sick, restaurant, so that rules out that explanation. Also, knowing that I fight with a pastor, or that you haven't seen me since pastor preached on lust, which hits me in the heart, right? You know that about me, and you know that about the situation, then, and you know that I have a motivation to drop out if maybe I'm a little bit immature, walk with Christ, and so here's something that hits my heart, I run away from it, drop out. That's a reasonable explanation. Things that you know true. Now, given what you know, the conclusion makes a lot of sense. Right? It's not absolutely certain, but it's very reasonable. Doctors do this when they're trying to make a diagnosis of an illness, and detectives do this when they try to figure out what happened at a crime scene. And what they're constantly trying to do is gather more data. That way they can better explanation for what happened. So this is where the minimal facts argument comes in. Nope. Minimal facts argument. I've kind of combined, well, Gary Habermas is a historian and a New Testament scholar. He's the one that proposed this minimal facts argument. And I've also combined the facts that we're going to look at from a demonstration from William Lane Craig. He's a theologian, scholar, and apologist. Now, minimal facts argument, basically, if you don't take the Bible as scripture, like we just go, okay, cool. We're not even gonna start with that assumption. We're just gonna take it as a historical document from the ancient past. Have these thousands and thousands of manuscripts, most well verified ancient text in the world. There are so many copies of it. As a historian, it's like, oh, okay. A lot of evidence, physical evidence to look at. So if we start from a almost unbelieving starting point, and just as a historian looks at it, and the New Testament documents are historical documents, ancient past, so you can look at them from that lens. You look at them from just that lens, what do you get? Get certain facts about concerning the resurrection. So, what this argument does is it starts with the accepted facts surrounding the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, and then try to come up with the best explanation for those facts. So, almost all historians, and you have to say almost, because always a fringe few that just, well, I don't want to say any of this is true, so they just reject everything whole cloth, doesn't matter. So, but almost all historians, whether they're believing or unbelieving, theistic or atheistic, they agree to these historical facts. Sorry, start with accepted. Yeah. So, what best explains what explains the facts the best? Whether they're believing or unbelieving historians. Here are the facts. So it's probably really small. I apologize. But first, death by crucifixion. So this is a historical fact. Jesus of Nazareth died by crucifixion. And by crucifixion, we mean he hung on a cross. They put nails through his hands and his feet. And when he died, the Roman person in charge of the crucifixion also stabbed him in the side to verify that he was dead. He was definitely dead. For sure dead. Not mostly dead, definitely dead. Next, there are women that find an empty tomb. So, women. First appearance, well, they find an empty tomb, and then the first appearances, women. Well, they're the ones that go and tell the disciples. But women find an empty tomb. So we have death and an empty tomb. His disciples had experiences that they believed were of the risen Jesus. You just take that on its own, could think, oh, well, they just believe that they had seen the risen, but it wasn't real. Well, more facts to consider. All you had were those, then you could maybe make an explanation that, oh, well, they thought they had seen the risen Jesus. It wasn't actually true. You know, and come up with some other story to explain it. But there's other facts. So, the disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe Jesus had risen from the dead despite every disposition to the contrary. So it's like, what explains disciples coming to believe that Jesus is dead? Because it was sudden. They were hiding out, trying not to be caught by the religious authorities. They didn't want to die themselves. and they believed it sincerely. Resurrection, bodily resurrection of Jesus. Now, because of that belief that Jesus was raised from the dead, they were willing to suffer violence and even die for this belief. What explains that? Again, if they were hiding in a room, trying not to be caught by the religious authorities, why would they then go out and preach that Jesus was resurrected from the dead and be willing to suffer violence and even die for that belief? That that turnaround, that sudden and sincere belief, that what explains that? That's a fact. That that's what happened, but what explains that fact? Then they began preaching about the deity and the death and resurrection of Jesus. That began very soon after the events happened, like immediately after. What explains that? Why would they start preaching that Jesus is God? Why would they start preaching resurrected from the dead bodily? Not only that, uh, enemies of Christ were converted. Two main examples that are historically uh, that are historical facts. First, that James, the brother of Jesus, we're taking the New Testament. It says, brother of Jesus, he didn't believe that Jesus was Christ. He was Christ, the Messiah, until after the resurrection. So it wasn't until after the resurrection that James became a believer. Saul, or Paul of Tarsus, capitalized Tarsus. Um, anyways, uh, he was a persecutor of the church, and then he had a version into believing that resurrected. What explains that? That's a fact of history, but what explains that fact of history? Given these are historical facts accepted by almost all historians, what best explains facts? Similar to a crime scene investigation, there are many data points. From those data points, we have to try and come up with a story. What happened? The best explanation for the data points observed. What are those? Well, a bunch of other explanations, but first foremost, resurrection was real. That's an explanation of the facts, history. Resurrection actually happened. Considering all of the facts, and this is just the minimal facts. Right? You could add more, and I kind of added a few more as I was talking about each one of these points. But like you could give 3 facts, 6 facts, 7 facts, 12 facts, whatever however many you want to do. But just these minimal amount of facts, what best explains them? Well, that the resurrection was real. That's the best explanation. Well, there's other explanations too, and none of them really fit the data points. Right? So, first, you got the swoon theory. Basically, what this means is that Jesus didn't actually die. So, that goes against the first fact of history. He didn't actually die. He placed in a cool tomb. He wasn't dead. He was revived after 3 days. Somehow, after being beaten almost to death and then hung on a cross, didn't die, stabbed, didn't die, was strong enough to move the stone and then go hang out with his disciples. And then they saw him mutilated and half alive, managed to talk to his disciples, and then they were super stoked on preaching this message. Like, it doesn't really make sense, right? It doesn't fit that Jesus actually died by crucifixion. Um, like, doesn't explain. It wouldn't explain why they had a sudden and sincere belief that he came back from, and like you'd be weak and wouldn't inspire kind of preaching that you've seen. Then there's the twin theory, and I'm only giving a couple of points against these. Do more research and people who address these in more detail, but the twin theory, right? So twin, and there was one that got put in the grave, and the other one was hidden away, and uh, and when it came time, the other twin came out and talked to the disciples. That explains why they thought they saw Jesus, because twin. And like this just sounds like a movie. Sounds like uh Christopher Nolan movie, The Prestige, right? The twin theory. Um, well, then you'd have to explain two bodies instead of one, and then you have to. This explanation requires more hypothetical entities to explain away the simplest explanation. Um, so there's this principle in philosophy called Occam's razor, and it's basically like you have two competing theories, and one is more complicated or requires more hypothetical entities to explain the same data than this other one that's more simple. You ought to always go with the more simple explanation, because why would you complicate it more than it needs to be? Twin theory definitely does that. So, um, it also doesn't fit with James, the brother of Jesus, becoming a believer because that was his brother. Unless Jesus had a secret twin entire life, none of his closest disciples knew about him, and his brother who grew up with him didn't know about. Like it's just anything will do besides the actual resurrection. Mass hallucination theory. So this is where everyone that thought they saw Jesus was actually just hallucinating. Now, there's kind of two ways you can look at this. Like every individual was hallucinating. They individually saw Jesus, actually see Jesus. Um, Hallucination. Well, that's a problem. That's not really how hallucinations work. Verify whether or not you're hallucinating. Hey, are you seeing what I'm seeing? And you look at the person next to you. Like, yeah, are you seeing this? Most of his appearances uh, had other witnesses available, and 1 Corinthians 15 records that over 500 people saw Jesus all at the same time. Hallucinations don't work like that. You have multiple different people at multiple different times. Hallucinations happen individually, not in mass. So it doesn't really make sense. And that doesn't actually address finding an empty tomb. And if it was all just a hallucination, then his body should be there. Not empty tomb. It's not explained. It doesn't take that fact into the explanation, because it doesn't take that fact into the explanation. It's rejected as a better explanation than the resurrection was real. All right, the spiritual resurrection. So, uh, Jesus didn't actually bodily, physically uh, rise from the dead. Spiritual, which doesn't fit the empty tomb. Again, if it was just spiritual, body should be tomb, empty. That's one of the facts. Doesn't make sense that the disciples would suffer violence if it was just a spiritual resurrection. Why would they suddenly and sincerely come to believe actually risen from the dead? resurrection. Why would they suffer violence for that? Spiritual. By the way, that's not what resurrection means. A spiritual resurrection isn't actually resurrection. Resurrection means a physical bodily coming back from the dead. Like it means, dead, grave, and then you back up and alive again. That's what everyone in the ancient world, that's how everybody understood resurrection, what the word means. So say it's a spiritual resurrection is actually to use kind of a contradiction in terms. It can't be spiritual resurrection. Resurrection has to do with the body. It just doesn't fit on a lot of levels. Wrong tomb theory. So just went to the wrong tomb. Why it was empty. Okay, well then again, like Joseph of Arimathea provided the tomb, so like he got his own tomb wrong. Like it's like that doesn't make any sense. Oh man. Um, and again, if they went to the wrong tomb, it doesn't explain any of the appearances of the risen Jesus, why the disciples suddenly and sincerely came back from the dead, and they were willing to suffer and die for that belief, and that they started preaching about his deity, death, and resurrection. Like, they just went to the wrong tomb, and really makes sense. Um, Missing body theory. This is maybe they went to the wrong tomb, and now the body's missing, and they just a missing body. That's what explains it. Doesn't doesn't address why again. Um, you know why the disciples came to believe it's true, why they preached it, why the enemies of Christ converted, why James, the brother of Jesus, converted, why Paul of Tarsus, why he converted. The idea here is like the body was never put into the grave; it was put in a common grave. Have a body, so the story, full of fast one, doesn't fit with the rest of the facts. Then there's a conspiracy theory. This goes all the way back to the time of the event, where religious authorities said it was just one big lie. They bribed the Roman officials, and disciples are lying. None of this actually happened. And all of the disciples are just promoting a giant lie. Again, it doesn't like, why would you die for this if it was a lie? Why would you preach deity and the death and the resurrection of Christ and the implications of that? This is throughout the entire New Testament that we're supposed to be a paragon of truth. Not supposed to lie. We're supposed to be hold the highest standards of morality because like all of the theology and the practical application of that smashed together. So saying that it's just one giant conspiracy doesn't doesn't make sense with the preaching. Um, doesn't make sense that the enemies of Christ would believe that lie. They were just really duped, and then all of history, all the on millions of Christians believing this giant lie doesn't really make any sense. Doesn't fit. It doesn't. Not a better explanation, right? It's not a better explanation than resurrection was real. Now, does this give us absolute certainty? No, but it doesn't necessarily have to. And I would say that's where our step of faith comes in. But it's the best explanation. If you don't accept that explanation, you're being unreasonable. Yeah, you're being unreasonable. And I would love to persuade you to believe the most reasonable explanation for all these facts, because these are the facts that almost all historians accept. Just be reasonable. Well, that's the the minimal facts argument by Gary Habermas, historian and New Testament scholar. And I hope it's an encouragement to you. I hope that these different ways of reasoning that you can think about those things, think about how you interact with people, how you try and be persuasive, know how to present uh, reasoning in a good way, present good arguments. When I say arguments, I don't mean being louder and being quick-witted and making jokes at people's expenses. No, an argument is providing good reasons for a conclusion that you hold. I have a belief, and I have these reasons for this belief. I'm able to share that in a coherent, cogent way that is persuasive. You can do that through deductive reasoning. You can do that through inductive reasoning, abductive reasoning. But if you're aware of those kinds of reasoning and that they don't necessarily provide inductive and abductive reasoning, don't provide certainty. They provide one, good explanation for the facts that are available. Two, you know, a good reason to believe the conclusion based on your repeated, consistent life experience, whatever's happening, and you have good reason to believe it. And when we get to the doctrine of God, and there are other inductive arguments for the existence of God that we'll talk about, like the cosmological argument, teleological argument, moral argument. We might even talk about the ontological argument, deductive. There's a bunch. This one, I wanted to encourage you with more about the resurrection. Our entire faith is based on this, on the resurrection. It's not true. Throw it all away. I hope it was an encouragement. Pray. Father in heaven, thank you for this morning. Thank you for the truth of your word and for the truth of your resurrection. Pray it's an encouragement to your people. And just thank you for the opportunity to teach here at this church to these people who've gathered to hear your word. Pray for whoever's preaching this morning, Lord, that you give them strength and give them the words to say. Open our hearts to your word. Help us to worship you in a way that you see fit and that you accept worship. Thank you for love and your grace towards us. Help us to be grateful and worship you, spirit, truth. In His name.